It's my pleasure to introduce Mitch McEwen. I have the pleasure to know her since kind of the beginning of her career. It has been incredibly intriguing and extraordinary to see her evolution, but at the same time, how many of her obsessions from the beginning remain very present today through his own practice and the teaching that she's doing now at Princeton, previously in Michigan. And I'm very curious about the title and the context of the conversation and the lecture that she's going to give it to us, uses of the normal as power. And I was thinking on Stephanie explained me how to pronounce the last name, and for sure I'm going to butcher it, but the Georges Canguilhem, The Normal and the Pathological, who was re-edited and revisited by Michel Foucault in the late 90s. It was kind of a forgotten and obscure author and book, at least in the Anglo-Saxon culture. And the premise, and the book is incredibly complex, but the premise was a simple one, in which the idea that the normal sees the pathological as the attacking agent, but the pathological sees the normal as the attacking agent. And this kind of a dichotomy has been always at the core, in many ways, in the conversation and discussion of the discourse of architecture. The other thing that occurred to me is, in this constant battle and running in schools like SCI-Arc and Princeton and any other of the interesting institutions, that we have this obsession for innovation and novelty, but in a way there are certain themes that remain recurrent and that we keep going back one way or another. So the relation between the event and the object, which is something that Mitch, I'm pretty sure she will touch on that. And it's interesting because in a way I was thinking that in many ways the evolution of architecture, a disciplinary discussion, is almost like a continuous collection of Moebius strips. Like every time that we think we are on the verge, we keep going back on the verge of moving forward, we come back and revisit concepts and so on. But like in everything else, it's slightly different. It's never exactly how it was, but there are these perennial battles of discussion between, which seems to be this kind of dichotomies that seems to be a convenient one, but one thing I would argue that is quite different in this particular time and era is the idea that these dichotomy are not as such, but I think they are much more models of new coherencies, of new forms of hybridization. So it may look at the surface that is part of the old dichotomy, but actually is remixing this with the possibility something innovative will do. And I think Mitch has invested a big chunk of her career speculating and thinking about this. So I'm very much looking forward to her lecture. It is a pleasure to have her here. So please join me to welcome Mitch McEwen to SCI-Arc.
All right. Wow, thank you. Thank you for that really generous introduction. Yeah, you picked up on everything just from the title. I almost feel like I don't have to give the lecture. I feel like I could just kind of flick through the slides. If you allow me, I just super appreciate being here, and especially, with Hernán being the director and introducing me here. If I could just tell one funny little story. I don't know, to me it's funny thinking back on it. When I was a student of Hernán's, maybe about halfway through the semester, I was reading the Harvard Alumni magazine, and I noticed that the cover had this kind of cellular kind of background and intelligent design. And I was raised in a strictly atheist household, so a lot of religious stuff goes over my head. And so I didn't actually read the article, but I just brought the magazine to studio, and I was like, intelligent design, I think this is related to what we're doing in studio. And Hernán kind of looked like I had completely spooked him out. And then I realized that it was a really bad idea to kind of show something without really understanding what it's referencing. So I appreciate that introduction, both in terms of kind of opening up what I'm referencing in the title here, and it's an honor to be here to kind of share where my work is at this moment. But the title itself, The Uses of the Normal as Power, it's actually referencing an Audre Lorde, the title of an essay by Audre Lorde. And part of what I'm going to do in this talk is sort of unpack an article that I have in Archinect's edition Ed 3, which is focused on the normal. And the normal here, in case it's not evident, if the normal, the normal as power, I'm interested in the critique of power. I'm interested in subverting power. So I'm not here to give a talk on kind of rah-rah, the kind of power of the normal, but rather how the kind of critical engagement with the normal, exactly that kind of dialectic, that we might have understood in this Foucauldian sense of pathology, maybe we could understand as a dialectic with eros, as a dialectic with the event, as a dialectic with bodies. And so to do that, I want to mention this Audre Lorde essay, which is titled Uses of the Erotic as Power, because part of what I'm going to do in this talk is trace through some of those ideas, talking about the event, talking about bodies, showing some of the work I've done in this realm, why this is specifically architectural, and then also link that to kind of techniques of working with robotics and computation, and then end up with what is not just a critique, but what I'm starting to kind of use theoretically as a framework for some of my work around kind of specifically black modes of speculation. So I'm going to end up with some of Fred Moten's ideas on consent not to be a single being. So with that, I'll start off both talking about the normal and also a little bit of my own biography in terms of some of the techniques that I've brought to architecture. So to start kind of with the argument that, again, I trace out in this essay by the same name, architecture occupies an incredibly privileged and robust capacity to deal with what is normal. How many disciplines deal with distribution, right, as in normal distribution, conventions, as in the kind of norms of behavior, and geometry, right, the simple normal of the orthogonal. Perhaps it is because we work in such a charged relationship to normalcy and normality that we so often avoid confronting them on all fronts. And just to give a little quick biography of myself in terms of some of the techniques here, I mentioned this on the sort of interview that might become a video, but my work in computation really started as a kid, as an 80s kid. I guess I'm kind of on the younger spectrum of the Gen X, and one of the kind of activities that I did in after school was to program in this little software called Logo, which I only started researching once I got to Princeton. I started doing some research on the history of computation because I got really invested in trying to figure out an analog, kind of like unearth the analog history of computation. Because when Turing was working on computational ideas, there was not yet this kind of dichotomy of analog and digital. And one of the things that I discovered in this research is that this roboticist, William Gray Walter, is the kind of, maybe the intellectual genealogy of this software that I sort of grew up with. And that he's known as a neuroscientist, but the reason that Logo, that little controller, is called a turtle is because these first analog computers that were built before semiconductors and transistors, these analog robots, were built as part of this cybernetic idea that William Gray Walter was working on in terms of understanding feedback loops, I guess what we would call swarm behaviors now, that these early turtle robots could achieve something that he considered lifelike behaviors just by working with photosensors and responses. And so in a way, what I'm going to show you sort of becoming an interest in robotics in the past few years in my work really in a way begins with my first early approach to computation as a place to kind of just code language and geometry in the same framework. And so now to kind of jump to the present, the Embodied Computation Lab at Princeton is a kind of facility. It's called a lab, but it's really the kind of wrong name because it's really a facility. And sort of within that, I direct a research group called Black Box, which is really sort of, this is not so much a mission statement as a list of related words. And some of these will be related to the themes that I sort of break out in my work. But the ambition is to engage nonlinear processes in design, often staged with robotics, but in sometimes algorithmic kind of processes that don't start with the robot, but often with material exploration as well. So I'm only going to show one quick example with the chair and then sort of hint at the end with a project that I'm just starting that's going to lead to some work with bamboo and some custom end effectors. But the work is very much also concerned with things like black ops and vectors and bodies. But of course, to kind of work as an architect in an academic lab, there's always that kind of specter of the media lab. I think in that kind of history, that kind of precedent, I'm more drawn to the urban scale work. And so today in this talk, I'm also going to trace through these different scales and how they operate in different modes of speculation and sort of thinking these critical engagements with the normal and with power. But in addition to that kind of specter of the academic lab, the other piece that I bring to Black Box is really a continuation of work that I started in Brooklyn about 10 years ago, founding something called Superfront, which was a gallery for architecture and a place really coming out of studios that I had done at Columbia and getting my Master's of Architecture. I was very interested in ways that architecture could kind of also get out of the computer, get off the page, and engage with other artistic practices and kind of imaginative practices that were sort of outside the discipline, but maybe concerned with having similar concerns or aligned concerns. So Superfront also kind of used the tactics of architecture to gain space. Basically, it kind of haggled with the Brooklyn landlord to get an $800 a month deal on this huge space with this huge backyard because we built it out ourselves. But I want to kind of use this to segue into these questions of the normal in terms immediately of bodies. And so this is a continuation of the argument that I'm tracing out in this article that I'll reference a bit before I get to these kind of more speculative ideas and the connection to what Fred Moten calls a Turing machine. But so as a starting point, let us consider that there's no such thing as a normal body, right? So this is around the normal and the kind of dialectic with the erotic. This may seem debatable, too much of an overclaim. Bodies can be measured in ways that quantify into linear units, meters, pounds, body mass index, and these can always be plotted on a distribution, right, a normal distribution. Let us start with something less debatable. There's no such thing as a normal event. An event can be repeated, yes, but to the extent that its repetition can be mapped into either the cultural sense of norms or the mathematics of a normal distribution, either recognizable in the former or quantified along some dimension in the latter, the event ceases to be an event. It becomes a ritual, even if infrequent but recognized, or simply behavior if repeated and recognized. For these reasons, there's no such thing as a normal event. What does this mean for architecture? And I'm showing just some situations that we staged. This is one a project called Archaeography. I partnered with Monster Black, who now is a kind of performance artist in his own right. And there's no kind of image ability to show the amazing choreography that they did with these ropes that are kind of mounted with into the masonry. So to continue, for one, we can look back on the event concerns of architecture after 1968, the European version, and understand the impetus of Bernard Tschumi and his comrades as partially a pretext to break architecture out of its norms. The event enables architecture to escape history. Unlike the autonomy of the author, the event does this while still potentially locating architecture in society. This is an important distinction and one belied by much of late 20th century architectural tendencies, maybe. So just to continue kind of getting into the work a bit, part of what we did at Superfront was also produce our own print, our own catalogs. We did these kind of alternative exhibitions and then produced catalogs because that's sort of what you do when you make an exhibition. But I think I think of this as a precedent for Black Box at Princeton now because there's this relationship maybe between theory and practice that was staged. To continue the argument, and again, I think I'm trying to situate this dialectic that's distinct from maybe normal versus complexity or normal versus the surreal in terms of normal versus the erotic or the body or the event. For our purposes, the most critical question then becomes not exactly one of society, but one of geometry and reality. Whether at the level of the event a la Tschumi, a social rupture, or simply a bodily event, architecture departs from the normal. If architecture isn't normal, then what does it normalize and how? Right? Because architecture does normalize, right? Even if what we do isn't normal. And in SCI-Arc, I appreciate having this discussion here. I think this is a place that really embraces architecture not being normal, right? And I want to kind of put that in dialogue within what is it that we normalize. So a few ideas about what it is that architecture normalizes and how we can operate in that without in a critical relationship to that power. So one idea I've been working on for some time is profound modernity. There's a text that I wrote for e-flux that focuses on Mexico City. And really what I was tracing in Mexico City is the ways that these kind of colonial imaginations of a dry land encounter this city that's built on a lake. And these are photos that I took before the huge earthquake in 2017, I think it was. But the earth was already kind of breaking open by all these excessive attempts to kind of drain it. So I want to link that to my own work in Detroit. And part of that has been understanding this kind of excess of different forms of objects that the city doesn't really want to plan but needs to plan. And so what you're seeing here is a subset of the vacant houses that are owned by the Detroit Land Bank Authority. And what I started to do was get concerned, and you'll see why. I'll focus on a couple projects that deal with these balloon frame houses. But I got specifically concerned with a mode of house that was built between 1890 and 1920 with these long lumber frames. And so part of the work became starting to figure out a kind of a hack into urban planning to locate a kind of object before it kind of could be known. And so some of the work entered teaching. I'm not going to show, I think this is the only couple slides I'll show from teaching. But at University of Michigan, we address this kind of question of the sort of excess, the sort of numeric excess of this mode of houses by designing 99 houses at one time. Sort of using this idea that we could sort of prehend the normal house and then also negatively prehend it just by setting up scripts that produced a kind of normalcy that then could be negated or undone. And so then we have this kind of field of operations that is really understanding the house as a kind of unit that normalizes space and that can be sort of negatively prehended in many of its capacities. And this became something that I was concerned about also in terms of infrastructure, similar to that story about Mexico City and the ground kind of breaking open from this sort of colonial imaginary that lives on to drain the city. When I got to Detroit, folks were protesting about water shutoffs. I'm going to drink some water. And I didn't understand why in a city that's surrounded by fresh water, this would be the case, right? So even old cars have these license plates talking about a water wonderland. Because, so that's Michigan. They call it, they reference a hand because it's shaped like a hand. And then the gray is the Detroit area. So this is 17% of the fresh water in the entire world. But still, folks in Detroit were getting their water cut off because their bills were often higher than the value of their houses, right? So their water bills would be $2,000 over 2 years, and the value of their house would be only $1,000. And I started, this is, there's a chapter in Ways of Knowing Cities, one of the Laura Kurgan edited book that's coming out of Columbia Books that unpacks this if you're interested in this story. But similar to my kind of obsession with analog computing, the research started to get concerned, and research is too much of a heavy word, it's just a kind of obsession. My sort of obsession to understand this infrastructure started to get concerned with the water meters. And really, this started to become evident that this was the kind of original smart city. So the kind of profound modernity that sort of normalizes and produces not just the normal house, but also this kind of mode of distributing infrastructure is also, of course, the same infrastructure that produces combined sewer overflow. All these kind of yellow dots you're seeing there, places of combined sewer overflow. And what started to be revealed just in mapping and using the maps to kind of reveal relationships is that the suburbs had figured out a way to sort of siphon off the water treatment from Detroit so that you have 3 million people who are getting water treated while the 700,000 residents of Detroit are being overcharged. So I'm going to kind of segue into an urban design project that sort of takes that lens into account to understand this kind of, these mechanisms of this profound modernity, how they're kind of exploiting certain situations on the ground, to look at a kind of neighborhood scale, urban design scale project that was commissioned by the city of Detroit. And this is this amazing neighborhood. I'm going to try to not even say the name of the neighborhood because folks in Detroit like to keep these things a bit local. But it's this neighborhood on the east side of Detroit that has these canals. It's a bit like Venice here, but without the sort of image of another place. These canals become these streets. And what we started to do, I was working with a landscape architect, W Architecture. What I started to do, what our team started to do, was really map out these vacancies. And again, there's this kind of excess of data. And so this was hundreds of blocks. Everything in green is owned by this Detroit Land Bank Authority. So the southern part of the neighborhood looks like these canals with these sort of motorboat kind of backyards. And then north of the main street, which is Jefferson, you have blocks like this with just these trees and a few houses. So part of what we started to do was try to understand these basically the boundaries, to release the boundaries of these land bank owned properties from the grid, and basically and just using a simple mesh. A mesh like you would use to create a kind of topology, here instead to create kind of new political boundaries, effectively to understand, and all this is doing is just sort of reducing redundant vertices in a mesh. But what that opens up is ways of understanding kind of contingencies and adjacencies. So looking at the specific, which is this kind of east-west Main Street, what we started to see was that there are these kind of archipelagos of these existing houses where you could understand sort of moments of a street as connecting houses. And really to get interested in ways that, something like this, just this blue, just this kind of dumb blue, could stage different relationships between those existing houses. Because effectively what happens is the basements in this neighborhood were getting flooded every time there was one of these combined sewer overflow events. And I'll come back to, you'll see more work on the scale of the house, but this was really looking at opportunities in this neighborhood to set up more of a kind of network system of these existing houses. And the balloon frame then being a way to think of how a house might be sort of prehended in a very simple way as something that could be operated on as part of a network. And so I'm going to show just what became kind of two blocks for an RFP. And this is very much, I think, the normalist power. One of the most uncomfortable moments of meeting that in terms of working at the urban scale is when you have to give these city planning presentations and the work is kind of filtered through the kind of mode of presentation of city planning. But what we were up against was this being the kind of normative operation. I've blurred out the name of the engineers who put this together, but the two blocks were imagined as this super block with a lot of parking in the middle and an LA Fitness and a Whole Foods and then future development. So this was the kind of baseline that we were working against. And basically just we had to show the city that we could fit all the parking and the housing and do multiple phases. But what became significant was more looking at this as a way to think of those phases in relationship to a different strategy for really what was the poorest, most precarious neighborhood adjacent to this. And so this became a strategy that the city needed to show like this in terms of really just understanding a series of sort of like low-scale apartment buildings. But what became significant for us was the ways that the later phases might open up a kind of archipelago that would move into the more stable neighborhood and think about a kind of parallel with the more precarious side that's been inhabiting this vacancy and kind of maintaining these close-scale relationships. So now I'll zoom into the more kind of architectural scale operations that also continue this line of thinking about these maybe like some of the cheapest houses in the whole country and how they might be operated on architecturally to do something that might be public, if not imaginative in themselves as objects, kind of platform for more of a public imagination. And so this is a project called House Opera, which really started as a kind of a tactic of just understanding these dynamics in Detroit through property taxes and real estate before anything spatial. Really, before I had been, I'm kind of working backwards in a chronology. So this was prior to this kind of infrastructural analysis. And the $50 bills are from artists who wanted to support this project in New York. And I'm going to come back to kind of where this is cited, but it's a neighborhood in Southwest Detroit that has retail and houses. And to think about maintenance is something that here the kind of first step was just bringing a poet to mow the lawn. Those of us who didn't grow up in the suburbs, who didn't grow up in single-family houses, really having to kind of discover for ourselves these kind of very normal things that you do with a single-family house. And what became the ambition here was to just kind of do an operation that would open up a kind of section that would operate more like what was happening on the street. And to think about this also in terms of there was this sort of large-scale plant growing through this, thinking about these kind of ruptures that could occur. And so the balloon frame then, as the project kind of got into the analysis of these existing sort of like the cheapest, oldest houses in the country, as I was mentioning, the thing about the balloon frame, because the members are so long, you can cut out the floor and cut out walls in a way that you can't when you're talking about a typical stacked, stick-built house. So these were no longer built after the 20s because if a fire could kind of easily go up the walls. But we started to look at ways that just the cladding with Tyvek, basically staging these kind of moments of construction, slowing some of them down, and then finding kind of excesses. I don't know, if it rises to the level of the erotic, but kind of staging something like these relationships between wallpaper and foliage that we found in the existing house. And doing that in a way where we called it house opera because we wanted the house to actually operate in a public way and in a cultural way. And so this became a stage, kind of cutting out that second floor and that wall, then made the house operate as a kind of stage for the neighbors, but also visiting artists. And we started to really locate this as a site for curating. So a woman named Ingrid Lafleur, who after this ended up running for mayor in this kind of weird art project, like a Boysian kind of project, Joseph Beuys, staged a series of festivals here. And it became a way of understanding, not just this balloon frame house, one of the cheapest houses in the country, but all of the cheapest houses in the country. And it's not something that I would say is a success in terms of I figured out a model. It wasn't a community engagement project. There were attempts at kind of locating these partnerships. But I'd say what ended up, being, I think, the most kind of effective outcome is actually just if you look at the top of this image, there's a baker that has been buying up these lots behind the bakery and kind of illegally using them for this truck access. And if anything, the project kind of hesitated also in that kind of like excessive asphalt kind of truck development that was happening around it. I'm going to now show, I think, what is the most kind of like horrific normal of all, which is a kitchen, which is, I think, my own kitchen. I don't know if one can think of anything that's more horrifically normal than one's own kitchen. But in Princeton, it's the first time that I lived in a place that's not a city. And this is the kind of horrific normal kitchen that we arrived at. And to kind of hone in on, in a kind of, again, a very kind of direct way, part of what this was about, so this is the house in Princeton, the normal produces mold, right? And I'll kind of get to some of these questions of kind of like pollution and body toxicity. But this kitchen was full of mold, right? If you think about drywall and fibers and how it combines with air circulation, it's a kind of recipe for mold. So the ambition here was simply to kind of create a situation that couldn't, that mold couldn't live in. And the only thing sort of that is specific here is a custom designed sink, this sort of 5-legged sink. But effectively what happens is we sort of treat, because the frame of the house is wood, we sort of leave the plywood so that there's wood meeting wood, and then have this kind of protective polycarbonate over everything. And everything is still maybe normal, but maybe not. There's a way in which, even I think in our field, part of what maybe kind of contains, so much kind of protects the power of the normal. I want to get back to the event because it leads us also to whiteness. But one of the things is the fire code. So there's no way that this meets fire code, but we did research kind of the relationship between this kind of slow burn of the polycarbonate and the wood behind it, and use the kind of fireproof plywood to do that. I want to get back to that kind of ambition of that graffiti wall at the House Opera. That got staged, another kind of iteration of that got staged at the Museum of Contemporary Art Detroit after we developed that first round of festivals at the House Opera. And this was one of the first projects I started working with the KUKA robots at Michigan. But I want to talk about this in terms of reparations and the kind of speculating around reparations, in the sense that one of the figures that I've been very interested in is W.B. Du Bois. And I'm going to come back to this with the last project that I show, which is leading towards the bamboo. That there's a way that Du Bois, I don't know if you know these amazing drawings and diagrams, they were just published in the past year or so. But these drawings that Du Bois did, they staged this kind of information on the page that I think also is kind of asking the country to think freedom as something spatial. And to stage this then in relationship to that kind of question at the scale of just a wall, part of what this was doing was continuing that kind of investigation of the balloon frame, but thinking of the balloon frame that in a material way, again, these were like literally the cheapest houses in the country, could be considered a kind of a platform in and of themselves for kind of experimentation and speculation. And this was starting to work with foam as a material of insulation, a material that, if you don't paint it, can be recycled, a material that's mostly air, and starting to just kind of quickly iterate through these a kind of material sense of how that foam could be thought of as like a kind of work of graffiti, like a large throw-up piece. And what that led to was thinking about just scaling up the hot wire. Obviously, the techniques themselves are not new, but scaling up the hot wire and then painting this so it's no longer recyclable. It did end up installed in the House Opera later, as a way of also kind of thinking about these kind of material conditions that are already existing as places to stage a different futurity. And I'll talk about that in terms of specifically kind of speculating while black. But I want to kind of group a couple projects together that might consider this kind of speculative realm of speculation. This was an invitation by Times Square to do one of these hearts in the Times Square Business Improvement District. And when it's always wonderful to be invited to do these things, but then, in terms of actually unpacking sort of what's at stake, it occurred to me that actually what this business improvement district does through architecture with this heart every February, and I don't want to insult anyone, but part of what they do is they obscure the statues on site. They obscure the statues and even the naming of the square. There's a square called Duffy Square with a statue of this person named Duffy that no one knows of anymore. And so what I staged was just a removing of that statue. And this was 2016. This was like early in this kind of idea of removing the Confederate statues. But simply to really, to both draw a link between the removing of not only these Confederate statues, but other statues that might be even sort of left proliferating simply because they're not charged enough to really be part of the debate, but also are kind of occupying a similar political realm. To kind of situate Times Square within that discussion, and also to sort of then push back against the sense that what architecture needs to do, sort of cover up things rather than getting us to deal with them. And so here, before I jump to, this was a workshop that I staged in Pittsburgh to kind of collectively, a workshop, I did a series of these called, this is what we will build when we get our reparations. And before I jump to that, just to kind of situate this is I think the last moment I'll really tie this into this argument about the normal. To situate then this question in relationship to the bodily event. Events I think I stopped with, right, what do we normalize and how? So the question of the event. Events can be looked on as so nicely disjoined from one another. You get a pattern of aspects. This is Whitehead speaking. Significantly, the gap between normalcy and the event opens, and I'm saying this, I think, with this because it's also this kind of workshop itself was an event, but I think maybe there's a way in which we can understand as architecture as participating in the event that disrupts a kind of historicity, right? That sort of changes history as it engages it. And I'm showing work that happened collectively through this workshop. Significantly, the gap between normalcy and the event opens a philosophical question that saturates architecture. 50 years ago, Alfred North Whitehead argued that Western philosophy had completely misunderstood reality from Plato through Kant by focusing on how we know objects rather than the real of events. Let us take seriously that this is a critique limited to Western philosophy. If one were to understand theoretical works differently to encompass teachings of the Buddha or West African dance or indigenous American forecasting, for example, the problem might not seem so immense. But in the realm of Western philosophy, Whitehead locates what might be considered a foundational error in the conception of reality. I'm saying this partially also because I think mapping and historicity comes up a lot in the work. Part of what we did was sort of stage these, what became evident was this kind of excess of reparations could participate with a kind of excess of design strategies. So afterwards, I kind of did another operation of collaging all the collages together. And this was also a little bit of a critique of the kind of charrette as a tactic. But while this may seem far removed from architecture, geometry is steeped in this issue. Right, this issue of the conception of reality. If the error of philosophy comprises locating reality in objects and the prehension of objects rather than in events, then how does the event become measured or geometric? What this might obscure is the movement between the reduction of what might be normal to stasis, even in the midst of a process that moves. Can movement be normal? Are bodies ever normal? And Whitehead again, the bodily event is in itself not as inspecting from outside, not what the surgeon sees when he cuts you open, but totality in itself. I would be remiss at this point, since we are talking about architecture after all, to not mention whiteness. Whiteness is the conceptual machine par excellence for generating the philosophically impossible feat of normalizing bodies and events. So if you want to know more about whiteness, you're going to have to read the article. I'm going to kind of jump to blackness later. But I'm going to kind of hesitate in, this was the Venice Biennale project for Detroit. I'm going to hesitate in this kind of notion of the event meeting infrastructure, where the site really became a way of understanding this huge bridge that Canada is developing because Canada kind of funds big infrastructure and this country doesn't, to connect Canada and its freighting with the United States. So we started to understand this site that's a few blocks up from there, this rail site, as implicated in this massive international trade, started to then kind of divide up these blocks into something that could be operated on by the neighborhood around it, so that the freight, and not just the freight, but also by moving the freight to rail, to shift even what this major international infrastructure was implicating, and then to be able to bring the workers and the housing closer to it. And then this became a way of staging, in a kind of bizarre way, a relationship between an air purification kind of giant machine and housing. Oh, whoops. I'm going backwards now. Oops. And this kind of obsession with the freight, meeting this other mode of housing, where the housing would participate in this kind of excess of the remediation of air pollution that's coming from the trucks a couple blocks down. And I look at this project now, a few years later, as staging almost a kind of a Green New Deal approach in some ways, thinking about the kind of workers' housing and the kind of quality of work as something that could be spatial, thinking about how the quality of the workers' engagement with the environment of their work would change the architecture around them, simply by asking the architecture to do kind of excessive things with remediation, with freight, with goods, with labor itself. And so now I'm going to shift to speculating while black. These concerns that I have around air and reparation, I'm going to turn to Fred Moten and what I mentioned as the Turing machine to unpack that, simply because, and this is just to kind of, again, talk about, for me, the relationship between theory and practice. I'm showing you an exhibition project for the Are We Human? Istanbul design biennial, where I was very concerned, similarly to that Venice project, with staging a kind of a situation about air, and it's called the glitter disaster. I was trying to stage through a fog machine a kind of glittery air and a remediation of that glittery air. But to talk about this logic of reparation, I'm turning to Fred Moten and the Turing machine, flesh thought inside out. The logic of reparation is grounded on notions of originary wholeness on the one hand and abstract general equivalence on the other. Bacon thinks this in relation to credit and imagination, but I wonder if it's not really bound up with a strange kind of empiricism. What's the relation between the logic of reparation and the logic of representation? And this was something, this is a question that maybe my work has been asking, but I hadn't really known how to say. This is a project that I staged at a gallery in London back in 2010, I think it was, where I was doing research on black sites. It was Obama was still president, but there was still this kind of residue of this awful war on terror that George Bush had started, and this kind of proliferation of these sites that the CIA had constructed basically to torture people. And part of my concern was that the way that this could be accepted as an ongoing reality was partially because we couldn't see them. And so I wanted to understand, was there a way that architecture could participate, sort of making evident these black sites, and using, in a way, the kind of facticity that was available to stage this. So what was known in these depositions from Yemen is that, or from Yemeni citizen that had been tortured, is that music and sound was used, that basically there was a kind of taking over of existing spaces that were covered in plywood, and then these loud kind of, music and sounds would be blared through. So I reduced that information to just this plywood wall with these transducers, which actually opened up this possibility that two people could kind of be on a microphone without sound interference. It kind of completely changed how sound occupied the space. This is a exhibition that I did with a collective called How Do You Say Yemen African at P Gallery that was interested in sort of staging, and this was before that kind of Russian hack to produce blacktivists and all this stuff, but this was 2016 when there was this kind of proliferation of Black Lives Matter was starting to really understand media as a way of, similar to the Black Sites Project, kind of giving us a way of accessing the violence that Black people face in this country from the police, from the folks they're supposed to be protecting. So to continue with the Fred Moten, this question of reparation and representation, what does that relation have to do with telling the truth, or the story, or the whole truth, or the whole story, with truth-telling as a way of making whole? The normative arc of becoming a subject, a citizen, is part of this logic. What if there were a radical politics of innovation whose condition of possibility is memory, which remains untranslated, whose resistance in turn makes innovation possible? Not to resuscitate, no resurrection, make it new, like they used to say, so that indexicality is in effect a technique, so that the recording is part of an experimental impulse. So I'm going to start to wrap up with some newer work that's a commission for a museum project, where I'm taking these concerns that I had previously addressed with these kind of, in a way, these ready-mades, these kind of like super cheap houses, my super cheap kitchen, as these kind of ready-mades that now I'm starting to think in the black box, sort of using the techniques of computation and the robotics to think the history of materials differently. And so this is a series of these there's a whole set of these models that we're developing in relationship to end effectors on the robots to operate on bamboo. And it's part of a project that I'm doing with an artist in New Orleans named Christina Robinson, who has this amazing counter-historical narrative of how a nation state would have emerged from a successful slave rebellion, the largest slave rebellion in North America, which was in 1811, just outside New Orleans, which Dred Scott is staging a reenactment of in a few weeks. And basically, this artist imagines a whole 200-year development of this kind of nation state, and I'm tapping into that in order to kind of quickly iterate a sort of missing 200 years of an architectural history. And so then to stage that in relationship to the specific material of bamboo, not in a kind of material, a kind of visual way, but more in a kind of structural and even kind of political economy of the project. Starting to map out regions of certain materials being available, basically imagining a kind of 200 years of architecture history that doesn't involve industrialization, but that does stage computation and robotics. And even the initial things like the south being up, the kind of cartography needs to shift. But I'm gonna continue with Fred Moten, because theory for me is often a way of sort of understanding my own intuitions better. So this idea of innovation in relationship to reparation, which then, again, I'm kind of using as a critique of the normal. I'm going to repeat the last part again. Make it new, like they used to say, so that indexicality is an effect, a technique, so that the recording is part of an experimental impulse. The archive is an assemblage. The assemblage is an image of disaster. But I just want you to enjoy yourself, and I want you to believe that. This is an enthusiasm. And that enthusiasm, I'm going to trace a couple projects at a different scale that I'm trying to bring to that kind of the kind of commission project that I'm hinting at, and that's really just at the scale of the body and furniture. I think I'm going to close with that. And this was what I called a street wearable table that I designed with a performance artist when I was doing a residency in Stuttgart. That really is concerned with, again, I think I'm interested often in a kind of cheapness as a kind of way of making something accessible in terms of understanding kind of political economy, but also maybe in a kind of way of kind of visibly pushing back against the sense that luxury needs to be the kind of mark of maybe quality, maybe desire itself. So here the table is designed to be basically supported with sort of any material square, foam core, cardboard that goes inside of it. It operates more like a garment. It can be rolled up. You could take a number of them to a meeting, to a park, and kind of to a street, and sort of make that street into an event, right? So this kind of relationship to the event staged here. I wanna kind of end with this idea of repair. Because I think it's something that maybe comes up at that larger scale of the infrastructure, and when we think of repair in a more complicated way, a more nuanced way, maybe we can think of it at the scale, the scale of the body too. So that maybe even the ergonomics is a site for repair. And so this was, I'm gonna end with this piece of furniture that we made, again, in a very simple way with the hot wire, but that I think is pointing at a larger set of issues that we're engaged now, kind of moving up to the architectural scale with this kind of idea of structure also being thought in a kind of seriality. So we did this group of chairs. One of them is the hot grandma chair, which was exhibited at the Storefront for Art and Architecture. There's a mutual transformation that occurs when the thing is engaged, a mutual supplement that serrates phantasmatic scenes of repair that is always manifest as getting through or past or behind it to its essence or its message. And just to relate repair even to this very simple material treatment here, so this is foam, just a block of foam. It's thinking a chair of something that wants to deliver itself, that wants to kind of be fabricated out of the material that it's delivered by, that it's kind of organized by, and more in a kind of a sense of how something is delivered than how it's produced, if that makes sense. And also the plastic wrapping here, why it's called the hot grandma chair. It's thinking about something like the plastic covered sofa. Again, one of these most horrifically normal kind of treatments. Something that I relate to my own grandmother in Washington, D.C., these kind of plastic covered chairs, as a way of positing these materials, not always in relationship to a kind of industrial perfection, but also to these kind of different, maybe cultural affects that they might engage. To continue with the Fred Moten, What if the message were displaced by the ongoing production of code, which is our social life, and what our social life is meant to conserve? What if what we talked about under the rubric of silence were discussed under the rubric of space, or in a different register, air or water? What is it like to be in the world with some other thing? And I'm going to close with that because part of what I consider within the realm of sort of speculating while black is this problematic of thinking as a thing. And that's something that one can be actually kind of optimistic about and kind of very, already a kind of critique of the normal embedded in that position of thinking as a person who has been treated as a thing, who has been thought as a thing. And with that, I will end. Thank you.